Hello, 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 and welcome to episode 14 of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. We wrapped up last week's episode after the death of Dr. Henry Cotton. Although there is plenty more to say about the history of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, I wanted to focus on the early history of the hospital and the practices that really separated it from other asylums. I want to wrap up this series on Trenton Psychiatric Hospital by discussing some of the people who lived and worked there. So, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. Today, I want to narrow the focus a bit more and highlight one of the key players during this time period. You may recall that Dr. Phyllis Greenacre was the young doctor who was called to investigate Dr. Cotton's treatments and to determine if his surgeries were really seeing the 85% success rate that he boasted about. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, I encourage you to go back to episodes 12 and 13 and listen to those first in order to best contextualize how Dr. Greenacre fits into this part of the story. I'm going to be drawing much of my information from the book Madhouse, A Tragic Tale of Megalomania and Modern Medicine by Andrew Scull, a New York Times obituary about Phyllis Greenacre, an article from the Jewish Virtual Library, and another article by Andrew Scull and Jay Shulkin about the lives and careers of Adolf Meyer, Phyllis Greenacre, and Kurt Richter. I wanted to offer the story of Dr. Greenacre because the more I read about her, the more impressed I was by her. At the time of this recording in March 2023, it's still Women's History Month. And what better way to celebrate than to feature this powerhouse of a woman? Dr. Greenacre was a force to be reckoned with during a time when women didn't have many rights. She was mistreated by many of her male colleagues, yet she thrived in her career. She somehow managed to balance so many life demands and create her own niche in the field of psychiatry. I had studied many of her counterparts throughout my own training in psychology, people like Anna Freud and John Watson, but I hadn't heard of Phyllis Greenacre, and I'm guessing that many others outside the psychoanalytic world hadn't heard of her either. So it is my privilege to introduce you to Dr. Phyllis Greenacre. Phyllis was born on May 3rd, 1894 in Chicago, Illinois. She was one of 7 siblings born to her mother, Mary, and her father, Isaiah, who was a successful and prominent lawyer, advisor to Chicago's wealthy elite, and an important figure in progressive politics. As she grew up, Phyllis found her father cold, distant, and arrogant, but perhaps his worst feature was his hypocrisy. Isaiah Greenacre, you see, had a secret family. He had his publicly acknowledged and, quote, legitimate family, according to Scull, of which Phyllis was a part, but he had a second family as well, consisting of his mistress and the children he had with her. He was able to financially provide for both families due to his wealth, but the second family didn't appear to be secret to Phyllis and her siblings. She would later recall that she tired of her father's open philandering and her mother's passive-aggressive comments about it. Phyllis watched for years as her mother struggled with severe bouts of depression that appeared to be linked to her husband's chronic infidelity. No doubt this impacted the way that Phyllis saw others and learned to cope with her own stressors. Outside the family drama, Phyllis experienced other hardships as well. She was born a twin, but her twin unfortunately died during infancy. Phyllis herself almost died several years later from scarlet fever. Notably, she had a speech impediment until she was 7 years old. It was unclear from Scull's text what kind of speech impediment she had, but it was clearly significant enough that she was unable to communicate with her parents. So she taught herself to read and write by 4 years old so that she could pass notes to her parents. From the very start, this was a very determined and intelligent girl, traits that would stay with her throughout her life. By 16, Phyllis knew that she wanted to attend medical school. And I just want to pause here and underline the fact that she is planning to go to medical school as a teenager. And as a young woman at that, she must have known the odds were against her. It was 1910. Women wouldn't even have the right to vote for another 10 more years. Her father, however, refused to pay for her education. We don't know the reasons why, but we know he had enough money to fund her schooling. This caused an irreparable rift in their relationship, and Phyllis would go on to be estranged from her family. Ever determined to go to medical school, she was able to take out loans to pay for her tuition. And so she began attending the University of Chicago. Many of her courses were lecture style, and because Phyllis was quite reserved and shy, she often sat in the back of the room. In most ways, she didn't particularly stand out, except when she began submitting research papers. Her professors later remembered that her written work stood out among her peers, and that's what they realized, that she was someone who was going to go somewhere. Phyllis was elected to the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, and I have to admit I got a little excited when I read this. I thought, oh, I'm part of that too. And then I double-checked my CV and realized I was part of the Phi Eta Sigma Honor Society. Still cool, but not the same one as Phyllis Greenacre. That would have been too cool. She ended up graduating with her Bachelor of Science in 1913 with honors for excellence for general scholarship. As she'd hoped, she planned to continue on to medical school. The Chicago Rush Medical School had only begun admitting women into their program in 1901, and even by 1913, they still capped the entrance at 6 women per academic year. The competition would be tough, but she made it. Phyllis became one of the half-dozen women accepted into the program in 1913. She would later indicate that although her education at Rush was good, there wasn't a lot of training in psychiatry offered, a problem for someone who wanted to go on to be a psychiatrist. She went on to graduate from the Chicago Rush Medical School in 1916 at only 22 years old. And she still had big dreams. Now, Dr. Greenacre, she had her eyes set on a prestigious internship, what we'd now call a residency, at the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Johns Hopkins had been even more hesitant to admit women into their program. Although they had technically been a co-ed program since their opening in 1888, they limited women to only 10% of all admissions. So she wrote directly to Adolph Meyer, with whom she wanted to work, and advocated that he hire her to his staff. That's pretty bold. She also got solid letters of recommendation from her professors and supervisors who vouched for her as an exceptional candidate. Once again, the odds were against Dr. Greenacre, but once again, she defied the odds. She was one of 3 women admitted that year. She must have been ecstatic. I would think that her family would be incredibly proud of her for this accomplishment, and maybe they were from afar, but no one was there to see her off as she boarded the train from Chicago to Baltimore. Other people had well-wishers seeing them off and waving, and I wonder if Dr. Greenacre felt lonely in that moment. There she was, making this big life transition, and no one was there for her. I imagine her sighing as she stared down at her ticket, then back up at the train, searching for her sleeper car. As she walked the length of the train, she heard a man's voice behind her. Dr. Greenacre! Dr. Greenacre! She turned to see an assistant from the Chicago morgue, rushing along the platform and carrying 2 buckets. He dropped them at her feet, a rush of wind exhaling as he did. "These are from Dean Dodson," he said. "One is for Popsy Welsh, and one is for Adolph Meyer." The unmistakable smell of formaldehyde struck Dr. Greenacre, and she wrinkled her nose. 2 pickled human brains. These brains would accompany her all the way to Baltimore. I imagine her frowning and stooping down to pick up the buckets. Perhaps people gave her odd looks as she walked by with wafts of astringent fumes trailing behind her. It was a good thing she had a sleeper car to herself, she must have thought. What would other travelers think if they knew she had 2 brains among her possessions? No doubt that during that long train ride, Dr. Greenacre thought about the stories she had heard about women at Johns Hopkins. Andrew Scull recounts some of these. Quote, "There was the notorious occasion when the professor of otolaryngology, had delivered my apologies to otolaryngologists out there, had delivered a lecture comparing the cavernous tissues of the nose with the corpus spongiosum of the penis, splicing his presentation with an array of smutty stories that had the male students rolling in the aisles and their deliberately humiliated handful of female counterparts beat red with embarrassment on the brink of reconsidering their choice of career. Then there was the time that Dorothy Reed and Florence Sabin had the audacity to earn appointments in medicine, the most prestigious of all Hopkins internships, by graduating at the top of their class. The superintendent of the university hospital, Henry Hurd, had immediately attempted to persuade at least one of them to relinquish her appointment in favor of a man, end quote. And just a quick interruption to say, I hate that. It's not cool. I mean, that should be obvious, but those women graduated at the top of their class. They earned that spot. And the superintendent wanted one of them to just hand over what they'd worked for? No way. Anyway, Skull goes on and it gets worse. And quick trigger warning for outdated and racist language. These are direct quotes from the day. Quote, Henry Hurd assigned Dorothy Reed to the charge of the male Negro ward, certain that any young lady could not possibly accept such a post. And finally, when she still proved obdurate, informed that, quote, he understands that she wanted the color wards and assumed it reflected her abnormal sex perversions, since only her desire to gratify sexual curiosity would allow her or any woman to take charge of a male ward, end quote. And of course, I have something to say about this. I work entirely with cisgender men right now, and the thought that working on an all-male ward would gratify some sort of sexual curiosity just baffles me. If the reason someone is working with any patient is to fulfill sexual curiosity, then they probably shouldn't be working with any patients. But what I think Henry Hurd was implying here is that a woman working with Black male patients must be seeing them as some sort of spectacle. And that implication is also pretty gross. Now, to her credit, Dorothy Reed didn't bat an eye, and Henry Hurd didn't get the shocked reaction he was clearly hoping for. Perhaps these women doctors would be all right after all. When Dr. Greenacre arrived in Baltimore, she noticed the striking differences between her new town and Chicago. The sizes of the cities were different, and Baltimore was clearly older with a Southern influence. Andrew Scull points out that at Johns Hopkins, she was, quote, first assigned to the pathology department and then to the neurological services, both areas in which she had some prior background from her coursework in Chicago. Spending long hours in the morgue, she worked on an article on brain hemorrhages, which afterwards became her first professional publication, end quote. When she moved to the Phipps Clinic to begin her internship, she had decided that she wanted to become a psychiatrist. Problem was, as we mentioned earlier, she didn't have a lot of coursework in psychiatry in medical school. Now she was in a place where medical students several years behind her knew more than she did. She got anxious and felt unsure of herself. She wondered if she'd made the right decision. How did everyone else seem to be getting by just fine, and she felt like she was barely holding on? She tried to reassure herself that she had earned the right to be there, and she was capable, but she was filled with self-doubt. It didn't help much when she met Adolph Meyer, who would become her supervisor. You may remember me mentioning Dr. Meyer in the previous episodes because Dr. Meyer was also the advisor for Henry Cotton. And, fun fact that has nothing to do with this, it was Adolph Meyer who introduced rats as an experimental subject to the American University. So, fun fact. Meyer was a Swiss-born psychiatrist who was cold and spoke bluntly. Greenacre was terrified of him. For the first few months of working with him, Scull says Meyer was, quote, so remote, so unapproachable, his standards so hard to meet, and his ideas so enigmatic that she despaired of her future. In less than a year after her arrival at Hopkins, she had fallen into a depression so deep, a mental collapse so profound and disabling, that she could no longer continue to work. And Meyer himself diagnosed her as psychotic, end quote. This is tragic and likely what we now call imposter syndrome. We know that Dr. Greenacre was intelligent, capable, and determined, and residency programs are extremely difficult, with lots of pressure and responsibilities and not nearly enough pay. It takes a toll on everyone, but not everyone has to take significant time off like Dr. Greenacre did. At one point, she was temporarily hospitalized for her own mental health struggles. She took off almost an entire year, but Meyer kept her on staff, as if he anticipated that she would return. And return she did. Sometime early on at her time at Hopkins, after Greenacre returned from her hiatus, she would prove how very smart and capable she really was. She was called to testify about the mental status of a defendant, and the young hotshot prosecutor in charge of the case seemed to take one look at the young woman doctor and hope to humiliate her on the stand. Could she, he asked scornfully, tell him how many bones made up the human skeleton? No, she responded, but I can name them all. And she began listing the names of every bone from head to toe. Himself now humiliated, the prosecutor had to force her to stop. And when I first read that story, I actually wrote, "Yas, Queen," in the margins of my book. I mean, how many of us would love to have a moment like that where someone questions our knowledge or skills or experience and we're able to slap back with a quick, smart response? Dr. Greenacre was back. Meanwhile, in January 1919, the well-known behaviorist John Watson had recruited a young doctor named Kurt Richter to his staff. Dr. Meyer invited Richter to attend staff rounds and give lectures, and in the process, he ended up meeting Phyllis Greenacre. As Skull says, quote, Kurt was a handsome former high school athlete from Colorado. He had spent 3 years in Germany, ostensibly to train as an engineer, but in fact, developing a taste for the theater, the opera, and literature. Back in America, a year and a half after the outbreak of the Great War, he enrolled in Harvard, casting about for a new career now that his earlier interest in engineering had waned, end quote. So, like Greenacre, Richter was drawn to psychiatry, although he was pulled more toward the biological basis of behavior. Both brilliant and determined, Greenacre and Richter quickly developed a romance. But there was a slight problem. Thinking of marriage could create problems for their careers. Well, really more problems for Greenacre than for Richter. Would she get distracted and quit the program? Would they be able to afford to live together on meager salaries? There were so many questions. And to top it all off, in those days, junior Hopkins staff needed permission from the university trustees in order to marry. So Dr. Greenacre approached Dr. Meyer, whom she now saw as a sort of father figure, to get his opinion. He appeared hesitant to give his approval. He worried that a hasty marriage might be the result of finally feeling better after nearly a year of emotional turmoil. And in true Dr. Greenacre brilliance, she offered this response, quote, I have never looked upon marriage as an attempt at a therapeutic adjustment as promising of any success or stability. It has always seemed to me that the half-digested problems are bound to be augmented by the new complexities, end quote. In other words, she didn't want to get married to fix her problems. She anticipated there would be new issues. She wanted to get married because she was in love. But Meyer still wondered how married life would affect the couple and their work lives. He preferred having women on his staff unmarried and undistracted. But there was no stopping them. And so in the spring of 1920, Phyllis Greenacre and Kurt Richter got married. Within weeks, Phyllis was pregnant with her first child. She worked up until she gave birth to her daughter Anne in February 1921. She requested extra time off, which was denied, and she had to use her vacation time instead. When she became pregnant again later that year with her second child, Greenacre again requested time off, early this time, to prepare for her due date the following spring. Again, it was denied, and she only had 1 month off work. Her son Peter was born on May 16th, my birthday, 1922. Now a mother, Dr. Greenacre was particularly concerned about finances. She and her husband were still earning meager salaries. What frustrated her was that she began noticing that unmarried women at Johns Hopkins were advancing and getting salary increases, while hers remained the same. Greenacre, though somewhat reserved, was very good about advocating for herself when needed. She went to Dr. Meyer to express her concerns. Quote, "My years at the clinic have taught me the necessity of getting dissatisfactions cleared up and talked out rather than storing up for a cumulative explosion," she said. "I think I am alone in the clinic in maintaining in the 6th year the same official rank that I achieved automatically when I was accepted as an intern." End quote. 6 years without a raise while seeing others advance? Ugh, that had to sting. All the while, Greenacre, Richter, and their 2 young children were living in a tiny apartment they could barely afford. Dr. Greenacre began struggling with her mental health and coped by overeating. Within months of Peter's birth, she had gained 40 or 50 pounds, which seemed to take a toll on her self-image. And her marriage was starting to deteriorate as well. They both worked long, hard hours, and between the financial strain and Greenacre's recurring bouts of depression, things weren't looking good for the couple. Their fighting began to escalate. The problem was they could barely afford to live together, let alone separate. That alone might mean complete financial ruin. So they opted to move into a smaller and cheaper apartment in early 1924, and it seemed as if the walls were almost literally caving in. All the while, Dr. Greenacre maintained a rigorous work and research schedule while looking for other opportunities to make money. She appealed to Meyer again and again, requesting extra work, which she sometimes got. She was offered a short-term assignment of a sex survey for the American Social Hygiene Association. Later, she would advocate for a raise. She had been earning $2,500 a year, which was only slightly more than her original wage when she began working. Her request was denied, and she must have felt so helpless. Then in 1924, Meyer offered Greenacre an interesting opportunity. Would she be interested in connecting with Dr. Henry Cotton at Trenton State Hospital in order to compare her results with his? What's more, the job would offer the equivalent of $6,000 per year, more than twice what she was already making. She leapt at the opportunity. Dr. Greenacre began by reading Dr. Cotton's book entitled The Defective, Delinquent, and Insane. Great title, right? And was immediately taken aback by how oversimplified Cotton's explanation of mental illness were. He maintained that the singular source of mental illness was focal sepsis, and she was skeptical of that theory. When she finally got to meet Dr. Cotton at the 125th celebration of the Bloomingdale Asylum, she, quote, got a curious impression of him, where he was withdrawn and a bit aloof in an informal group, but he must be a person of intense energy and hopefulness. I find myself very eager for the work, end quote. As we mentioned in the last episode, the job at Trenton was not an easy one. She was housed on a ward for the criminally insane 3 nights per week. She was hounded by Dr. Cotton, who seemed to discredit her at every turn. And she was reading horrific accounts of patient surgeries gone wrong or serving no purpose. Andrew Scull points out, quote, from the very first day, she had been disturbed by the hordes of malnourished, edentulous patients, pathetic creatures whom the attendants treated with indifference and worse. Within weeks, as even her preliminary findings showed how delusory Cotton's claimed cure rates were, she had become still more distressed by the parade of patients into the operating theater. She was uncomfortably aware that all this abdominal surgery seemed to be doing little good and alarmed by the quantities of physical damage and death that followed in its wake, end quote. One of her most difficult tasks was tracking down patients who had already left the hospital. We learned in the last episode that even the hospital's social workers were former patients of Dr. Cotton who seemed to be wanting to appease him. Dr. Greenacre knew that she would have to find the information herself. So 2 days per week, she drove around the state conducting interviews of former patients, their families, and neighbors to see how they were coping. It had to be tough work, but at least it got her away from the toothless, emaciated patients at the hospital. Last week, we discussed Dr. Greenacre's visit to Mrs. Anita Ludwig, the disheveled and dirty housewife whose alcoholic husband was physically abusive to her. In another home visit in early March 1925, Andrew Scull writes that Dr. Greenacre visited, quote, an isolated cottage on a farm outside Haddonville to interview Alice Stevens, a middle-aged woman the hospital records indicate had been released and subsequently found improved after a tonsillectomy and an extensive course of vaccine therapy, end quote. Now, excuse the long excerpt from Scull's book, but his retelling of the incident that follows is too good / too horrifying to recount myself, so bear with me. Quote, much knocking eventually brought a white-haired, amply built woman to the door in an old and very dirty dress that gaped badly, disclosing unpleasant glimpses of filthy underwear. After some delay, Alice, for it was she, admitted her to a disorderly and dirty living room, whose other occupant, a peculiar-appearing, angular, gaunt woman, promptly fled upstairs. Minutes later, still another figure tore downstairs, a tall girl with irregularly shorn hair and a hopelessly dilapidated appearance, shoes unlaced, clothing soiled, and a stocking hanging loosely around one ankle. Alice grimaced and introduced her daughter, Rebecca, a Swarthmore graduate and another former Trenton patient. The girl grinned repulsively and went silently back upstairs. By this time, a few minutes of conversation had convinced Greenacre that both women were still actively hallucinating and quite thoroughly mad. And given the oppressive atmosphere of the place, she longed desperately to leave. Alice, however, would have none of it, insisting on showing her the rest of the house. Everywhere there was dirt and disorder, dirty dishes, dirty tablecloths, filthy floors, piles of discarded clothes, and upstairs they once more encountered the gaunt, awkward woman who had fled when Greenacre first arrived. Introduced by Alice on this occasion as my boarder, Mrs. Wilson, who slept in the upstairs hallway. She, too, was evidently psychotic. Now somewhat alarmed, Greenacre steered her peculiar hostess back downstairs and sought somewhat desperately to make her exit. Alice Stevens was visibly distressed by the thought. Couldn't she stay? They could talk about books or about her son, a Rhodes Scholar who was off at Oxford. Greenacre could share their supper. Surely she didn't have to leave just yet. But making her excuses as best as she could and edging towards the door, Greenacre grew still more alarmed when she discovered that it was bolted and barred from the outside. End quote. Okay, pause. So this is reading a little bit like a horror film, right? Here she is in this house with these three actively psychotic women, and at first unable to leave politely, but then actually not able to leave because the door is barred shut. All right, back to the story. Quote, Mr. Stevens, who had apparently still been home when she arrived, had chosen to use their time upstairs to leave for his job across the Delaware, and, as was his custom, had locked the three lunatic ladies in for the day, end quote. There's something about him locking these women in every day that just seems like torture. I mean, not to mention dangerous. What if there was a fire in the house or something? They wouldn't be able to get out. But still, the thought of them being locked in each day is horrifying. Quote, once she realized what had happened, even Greenacre began to lose her equanimity. Recalling the scene some 6 decades later, she remembered some panic-stricken moments as she wondered whether she was destined to remain trapped in this house of pathology for several hours or more. Was she personally at risk, locked up with these three seriously psychotic women? On the contrary, it turned out that her hostess found the whole situation amusing, and after vainly trying herself to open the door, offered to help Greenacre effect her escape. Her first plan was to push a chair out the kitchen window and for the doctor to lower herself out onto it. But contemplating the 6 to 8 foot drop that still remained, her guest suggested an exit via the cellar might be preferable. Treating the whole thing as an elaborate game, Alice gravely escorted her downstairs and watched while her elegantly dressed visitor clambered over a pile of coal and squeezed through a narrow opening, emerging on all fours with a blackened and somewhat torn dress and dented dignity, but otherwise safe and sound. Afterwards, Greenacre could laugh about the experience, but at the time, it left her deeply shaken and questioning whether she had done well to accept Meyer's invitation to undertake the study in the first place. End quote. I can't imagine wanting to do any more house visits after that. I think I would be done. But as we know, Dr. Greenacre was able to complete her investigation of Dr. Cotton. The whole ordeal from start to finish took about 18 months, although she didn't spend the entire time at the hospital. As you may recall from the last episode, it was January 1926 that Dr. Greenacre and Dr. Meyer were finally able to sit down with Dr. Cotton to discuss the results. And you may recall that Cotton was not very pleased with Dr. Greenacre's conclusions. He accused her of skewing the numbers and misrepresenting his work. But after all her hard work, Dr. Greenacre wanted to publish her findings, and he used them in her testimony before the Bright Committee. But behind the scenes, Dr. Meyer forbade her from doing either. She knew that people needed to learn this information and to know what was really going on in Trenton, but she was essentially muzzled from releasing it. Meyer was the gatekeeper in this instance, and going against him and publishing anyway would entail a sort of professional suicide. Greenacre appealed to Meyer for a year and a half to publish her work, but he denied her each time. She never really understood why it was so important for Meyer to protect Dr. Cotton, the man who would later be known as the Mad Doctor. While Dr. Greenacre was working on the project in Trenton, her husband Kurt Richter was doing research work in Panama for a couple of years. They were rarely together, both increasing workaholics. The children were frequently left in the care of friends or their nanny when both of them were out of town. She was praised for her efforts. Out of all of the women at Hopkins, only Dr. Greenacre had been able to successfully combine work, marriage, and motherhood. Or so it seemed. The arguing between Greenacre and Richter only seemed to get worse. He resented that she continued in medicine, saying that it showed, quote, a lack of affection for the children, end quote. He further complained of, quote, her inability to create a home that would have attracted him, end quote. Ugh. Then Dr. Greenacre learned in 1927 that her husband had been having a long-term affair with a lab assistant from Hopkins. Even worse, the woman was someone Dr. Greenacre and her children knew and liked. She would later say that when she found out about the affair, it left her unable to sleep and in vivid pain. And Richter promised to fight her to the end. Devastated, Dr. Greenacre talked to Meyer about her quickly dissolving marriage. She had gone back to Trenton to wrap up the last of her work, but decided she couldn't keep up with everything going awry in her personal life. She knew she had to leave Baltimore. She was offered a job at the White Plains Hospital in New York, and so during the week between Christmas and New Year's in 1927, Dr. Greenacre left Baltimore. She left her children with Mrs. Meyer while she went to find a place of her own in New York. Her new job at White Plains was as a staff psychiatrist with the Juvenile Court and Department of Child Welfare. It wasn't an ideal post, but it was something for now. Soon her children and their nanny joined her. Divorce proceedings with Richter would stretch out over 2 years during this time, and their divorce was finalized in 1930. He refused all child support, saying that she chose to take the children. She chose her career, and so they're her responsibility. Meanwhile, back at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Meyer was sad to lose Greenacre as part of his staff. He feared that he would have to let Richter go because of the affair with the lab assistant. It was the same situation that had led Richter's predecessor, John Watson, to lose his post years earlier. But letting go of Richter seemed to be too difficult. He was too valuable, his contributions too meaningful to let go of him. Even given all the terrible things Richter said and did to Greenacre, Meyer seemed to let it go. In fact, when Richter submitted his resignation, Meyer allowed him to withdraw it, which he did. I imagined Dr. Greenacre scoffing. thinking she had to leave when she hadn't done anything wrong. Her husband was caught in an affair with a coworker and suffered no repercussions. Dr. Greenacre seemed to recognize that she needed extra help, so she sought therapy with a Jungian analyst named Beatrice Hinkle. And this is where Greenacre began to depart ways from her mentor, Dr. Meyer. You may recall from the last two episodes that both Dr. Meyer and Dr. Cotton were strongly anti-psychoanalysis and strongly anti-Freudian. But Greenacre appeared to benefit from the treatment. After working with Beatrice Hinkle, she worked with Fritz Wittels, who is Freud's first biographer. After Wittels, she worked with Edith Jacobson. Not long after her move to New York, Dr. Greenacre left her job at White Plains and became director of an outpatient unit at the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic at New York Hospital, where she would work until the late 1940s. By 1935, she was added to the staff at Cornell University as clinical professor of psychiatry. But she had found her home in the study and practice of psychoanalysis. By 1937, Dr. Greenacre began practicing as a psychoanalyst. Her research shifted focus from severe psychopathology to issues related to trauma, children, and personality. In 1941, she published a paper in which, according to the Jewish Virtual Library, quote, she sought the roots of anxiety in the birth trauma of the fetus, as revealed in the newborn child and in the memory traces of the adult patient in psychoanalysis. Birth, with its enormous sensory stimulation after the relaxed fetal state, in her view, produced a strong narcissistic drive and a defensive organization of anxiety in the infant, end quote. Around that same time, Dr. Greenacre joined the faculty of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and would later serve as its president from 1948 to 1950. In 1942, she also became a training analyst. By the late 1940s, Dr. Greenacre had quit her work at the New York Hospital and started her own private practice in Manhattan. Within years, during the 1950s, Dr. Greenacre was training more analysts than anyone else at the Institute. She had finally found her niche within psychiatry. Dr. Greenacre's resume would have been incredibly decorated already by this point, but she sought other opportunities for leadership and professional development. She joined the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Study of the Child, where she became a leading expert on the psychoanalytic study of children and adolescents. Her work in this area of psychiatry was evident in her involvement in various organizations. She served as the president of the New York Psychoanalytic Society from 1956 to 1957 and was the vice president and honorary vice president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. She also served as the president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Somehow, in whatever spare time she had, Dr. Greenacre also managed to write prolifically. She published a book in 1952 entitled Trauma, Growth, and Personality, which stemmed from her research regarding anxiety and birth trauma. The following year, in 1953, she edited the journal Affective Disorders. In 1955, she wrote a book that actually sounds really fascinating, which she described as a psychohistory of the lives of Jonathan Swift and Lewis Carroll, and she detailed their lives from a psychoanalytic point of view. Her other publications include her 1963 work entitled The Quest for Father, a study of the Darwin-Butler controversy as a contribution to the understanding of the creative individual, and her 1971 book, Emotional Growth, Psychoanalytic Studies of the Gifted and a Great Variety of Other Individuals. Obviously, Dr. Greenacre's research interests varied considerably. She studied everything from childhood and adolescence to personality traits like creativity and aggression. She even studied more taboo topics like the relationship between identity and body image and sexual fetishism. In 1970, Arnold Rogow conducted a survey of psychiatrists and found Dr. Greenacre to be the fourth most influential living psychoanalyst, after Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, Hyde Hartman, and Erik Erikson. After her marriage to Kurt Richter ended in 1930, Dr. Greenacre never remarried. She lived in wholehearted dedication to psychiatry and psychoanalysis in particular. Dr. Greenacre retired from her private practice at 90 years old. If that's not dedication to her work, I don't know what is. And she died on October 24th, 1989, at age 95. I should also add that her son, Dr. Peter Richter, followed in her footsteps and also became a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. At the time of her death, Dr. Greenacre had 8 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. What a legacy. So, I hope you enjoyed learning about Dr. Phyllis Greenacre as much as I did. She was bold and outspoken when she needed to be in a way that most women weren't even given the opportunity. I also appreciate that her hard times ended up essentially directing her career path. Her research into body image issues most likely stemmed from her own body image issues. And the pain of enduring a difficult divorce led her to seek her own therapy and, as a result, discover her true interest in psychoanalysis. I think many people similarly discover their passion or their purpose in the midst of difficult times. I don't want to presume to speak on behalf of Dr. Greenacre, but I think she would want others to flourish because of their hard times, not just in spite of them. I think she would want people to care for themselves first, knowing that you can't care for others while your cup is dry. And that's where I'll end the story of Dr. Greenacre. Next week, we'll wrap up the story of the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital with some patient stories, including the story of an alleged doctor who kept returning to the hospital only to escape later. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you haven't done so already, please rate and review my podcast wherever you found it. It really helps me out and helps others find the show too. Feel free to stay in touch by emailing me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. And that's also the place to request an invitation for the Facebook group. Just send me an email and I'll add you to the group. So thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it. And as always, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.